My name is Zia Mian. I'm a physicist. I'm part of the program on science and global security at Princeton University. And the program works on developing technology, ideas, and policy initiatives for contributing to progress on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. My first real encounter with nuclear weapons and nuclear testing issues was actually in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, when there was a great concern about the relations between the United States under President Reagan and the Soviet Union, what was called at the time the Second Cold War, and the movement of new Soviet missiles into Europe and of new American missiles into Western Europe, the cruise and Pershing missiles. And people started talking about the neutron bomb and cruise missiles. And I was a young physics student, and people kept saying, "You're a physicist, what does all this mean?" And so I tried to educate myself and understand what was going on. And seeing the enormous public interest and public protest and participation in these questions of what do nuclear weapons mean for society and for international peace and conflict, it became, I think, a sense that one has an obligation as a citizen of your country, as much as being a human being, as well as being a scientist, to how can you contribute to helping people understand what these things mean so they can better participate in the decision making in their own society about how to think about these questions and whether countries should, how countries should respond to the challenges of nuclear weapons in the world. It was central to shaping my career and my professional path. And the critical part of it, I think, was the fact that large numbers of ordinary people were demanding the right to participate in the decision of their government about what do nuclear weapons mean. There were protests of millions of people across Europe, in every country, and in the United States, and in Russia even, saying that we don't want nuclear war, we don't want nuclear weapons. And so the question was, so then what do we do? And that became a challenge as a citizen and as a scientist to think about how can we help this process of democratic participation. At that level, my participation really was involved at the level of educating myself and then beginning to try and help educate other people about what do some of these things mean so that you can arrive at your own understanding and then decide what you would like to do and what you want your government to do. And I think the idea of this as a career only opened up later on when I realized that you can do this, in a systematic way. And so I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to combine, my interest and my sense of responsibility as a citizen with an opportunity to actually build a career. The coming of nuclear weapons into the world at the end of World War II created a special position for scientists, especially physicists, in thinking about certain kinds of issues of war and peace having to do with nuclear weapons and nuclear energy because of the special role that scientists had played in developing nuclear weapons. And so this went in two ways. One good way was that some of the people who had worked on the American nuclear weapons project, the Manhattan Project, when the war ended, they tried to educate the American government, for many of whom nuclear weapons had been a secret, about the dangers of nuclear weapons, and to educate the American people about the dangers of nuclear weapons. At the same time, there were other scientists who said that they would make careers making nuclear weapons because they saw this as technically challenging and interesting science. So the scientific community divided on these questions. But in both parts, there was a recognition among the scientists and the larger community that technical understanding was central to developing proper policy about nuclear weapons, whether you were for nuclear weapons or against nuclear weapons. And so, for me, I think the special role that physicists were given is not something that one can avoid or one should try to avoid. One just has to understand what that role is. And it's a double role. It's a role that scientists can play in finding ideas and opportunities for policy that might not occur to people who don't have technical training. Physicists don't have all the answers, but because of their training, they can sometimes see a problem that politicians and diplomats might not see, because that problem is a consequence of the science and the technology, not the politics. But sometimes they can also see a path forward where the politics and the diplomacy can't, because there might be a scientific option that would otherwise not be clear. And so scientists have this role, and they can embrace this role to try and help inform the democratic process and the decision-making process. And so I think that that's where it's both a gift and a curse of the nuclear age, that physicists have been given this role, scientists more broadly have been given this role. And so I think that, there are lots of scientists who work on nuclear weapons, and there are a few scientists who work on how to get rid of the danger of nuclear weapons from the world. And this is part of the process that history has given us. The importance of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has been recognized for a very long time. It was one of the very first ideas that people had, because they realized that the development of nuclear weapons and the evolution of nuclear weapons capability depends on being able to test the technology. So for nuclear weapons, that meant carrying out nuclear weapons tests. And we know how important it was, because we know the United States conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests. The Soviet Union conducted many tests, and all the nuclear weapon states conducted tests, because this is a necessary element of developing nuclear weapons and modernizing nuclear weapons. And what the test ban idea, starting from the early 1950s, did was to try and stop the future evolution of nuclear weapons capabilities by ending testing. The tragedy is that it took such a long time to get to a comprehensive test ban treaty that the countries that had nuclear weapons had done so many tests that they were comfortable with the designs of the nuclear weapons they had. But even then, there's been a fight to get them all to sign and ratify the nuclear test ban. I mean, the United States has still not ratified the test ban. And so it remains a continuing, an important issue, because if it wasn't important, then the countries would all have signed and ratified it. The dilemma that we face, though, is that because of the development of technology and the understanding of science made possible by nuclear weapons testing, some countries have developed a confidence in being able to maintain and even modernize their nuclear weapons capabilities without physical testing. And so that limits the impact of the comprehensive test ban on all nuclear modernization. So we see today that the United States especially, but also Russia and France, are modernizing and upgrading their nuclear weapons capabilities without the resort to explosive testing of the kind that they carried out before the test ban treaty. But that's something that we have to live with. And first we have to make sure that the comprehensive test ban treaty enters into force, and that we can build on that, and then think about what do we do about the new capacities that nuclear weapons states have developed to continue modernizing their weapons without testing. They're the ones who believe that they may need to do more nuclear testing to establish their confidence in their nuclear weapons. And so for them, I think it is clear that there is not confidence. India and Pakistan carried out nuclear tests in May of 1998. And they've had a moratorium on nuclear testing since then. And so what a comprehensive test ban treaty would do in South Asia is to turn that moratorium into a permanent end to nuclear testing. Without a CTBT, though, without India and Pakistan joining the test ban, what we have is that there is a continuous readiness to resume testing. And that allows pressure from the scientists and from the weapons complex in both countries to keep saying to the policymakers, let us do more testing, because there's nothing that stops us from more testing. And so a moratorium is something that is within the policymaker's decision, because it's a unilateral measure. An international treaty binds you to a commitment to the rest of the international community. And so the political weight of that is much larger than a unilateral commitment to a moratorium. And so what we see in South Asia is that every so often weapons scientists go to governments or start a public debate in the media saying, oh, we need to test. And so then lots of anti-nuclear activists and sensible policymakers have to push back and say, no, no, it would be very dangerous, very costly, it would be bad, we don't need to do this. And so the situation calms down, and then they come back and try again, because that's what weapons scientists do. You know, they develop nuclear weapons and they want to test what they've done. And so what a test ban does is that it increases the force that holds back the pressure from the nuclear weapons complex and the nuclear weapons scientists to use testing to keep their activities going forward. And in that way, a comprehensive test ban that would bind India and Pakistan would help stabilize the situation and restrain the nuclear weapons communities in those two countries from continuously pushing the policy process to develop more and different kinds of nuclear weapons and to test those nuclear weapons. The test ban is a restraint on the political pressure from weapons complexes. It's not a restraint on countries keeping their nuclear weapons. It's a restraint on the endless demands from weapons complexes to keep modernizing and keep diversifying and keep developing new generations of nuclear weapons. For some countries, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is a technical restraint because they have done few tests and they have decided that they are confident with the nuclear weapons designs that they have and that they don't need to keep developing and diversifying nuclear weapons. For other countries, it's not as much of a restraint, and this just reflects the fact that some countries have been designing and developing nuclear weapons and testing for much longer and much more frequently than others. I mean, China has only done just over 40 nuclear tests. The United States has done over 1,000 nuclear tests. And what you can learn about nuclear weapons is determined in part by your experience of testing them. So a country that has done 1,000 nuclear tests has learned a lot more about nuclear weapons than a country that has done 40 nuclear tests or 10 nuclear tests. The real question is, how much confidence does a country want in its nuclear weapons? And what is the relationship between the nuclear weapons complex and the decision-making process? In some countries, the politicians are very clearly in charge and they restrain their nuclear weapons complex. In other places, the nuclear weapons complex has historically been very strong and is able to use public opinion and the political process to push policymakers to keep opening the door to nuclear weapons modernization. And for those countries, there is endless demands for modernization and funding and new technologies. And there, the test ban is a partial restraint and not as much of a restraint as it can be in other places. So it doesn't, because countries are not at the same level of their abilities to deal with nuclear weapons issues and nuclear testing issues, the test ban can't be an equal restraint on all of them. What we've seen is that when countries debate signing and ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the relationship of testing nuclear weapons and keeping nuclear weapons starts to become clear. So in the case of the United States, when there was a debate on the ratification, what we saw was that very senior officials, including the US Secretary of State, would go to the American Congress and to the American people and say, we can sign the test ban, we can ratify the test ban because we can maintain our nuclear weapons without testing, right? That this will not undermine in any way our nuclear weapons arsenal or our nuclear weapons capabilities. In other words, this is a treaty that will make no difference. Therefore, we can do this. Right? This undermines the notion that the treaty is actually a restraint. There's an interesting relationship between nuclear weapons and how countries see themselves and ideas of power and military strength. So if you look at the countries that have nuclear weapons, it's either countries that have notions of being great powers, of having influence on international events far away from defending their own national territory. So the United States and the Soviet Union had so much military power that's why we invented the word superpower, because they had global influence on events that were far away from where those countries were and had nothing to do with the well-being of their people or defending their territory. Britain and France, by virtue of being great former colonial powers, had hundreds of years of that as their notion of themselves as countries, of being great powers with influence all over the world. And so to me, it was no surprise that these are the countries that were the first to embrace nuclear weapons, because they saw this as a way to continue and emphasize their global capacity to influence things. Now, China sees itself as a rising power and as a potential great power, and so also sees the need to project power, and sees itself as the victim of the projection of power by other great states in the world. And other countries who don't have necessarily great power identity issues or interests see themselves as countries that are so vulnerable because of their location that security overwhelms all other policy concerns. And so for them, nuclear weapons are part of the security complex that overwhelms economic issues and other kinds of issues. So for countries like Pakistan and North Korea and Israel, they see themselves in positions where they are under such great threat that military security is more important than anything else. Having nuclear weapons hasn't helped the security of these countries at all. All it does is reflect the fact that policy making in these countries was captured by people who have a way of thinking that security and military security is more important than anything else. So it's not a rational judgment. It's a judgment made by people who value this as more important than anything else. And so you see it in Israel, you see it in Pakistan, you see it in North Korea, that military ways of thinking, and often people with military backgrounds, dominate the decision-making process. So this is how they see the world. And so it's not the fact that having nuclear weapons makes you more secure. There are many arguments that having nuclear weapons, especially in these countries, have made them much more vulnerable and much more insecure and created much greater security threats. The question of how do we go forward in the question of nuclear weapons is very important, I think. And my own understanding is that we have to begin with where the UN Charter started. That the purpose of an international community is the collective care of people everywhere. And as the Charter says, the goal is to free humanity from the scourge of war. And I think when we start from that and we recognize that as an international community, we have then to ask the question that what is the behavior and conduct of the great powers in the international community? They're the ones who shape the understanding of the rest of the world about what is reasonable and practical and possible. And as long as countries like the United States and Britain and France and Russia hold on to their nuclear weapons and continue to insist that these weapons are necessary for our defense because they are an enormously powerful military weapon, and therefore we will base our national security on the threat of war and the use of weapons of mass destruction, it's no surprise that generals and prime ministers in other countries think, okay, this is a good answer of how do we defend our country. It's only when we take the answer of nuclear weapons away as a possible answer to the question of national defense that we can begin then to confront the generals in North Korea and Pakistan and Israel and other countries that might want nuclear weapons, that there is no reason, nobody believes that nuclear weapons are the basis for a defense of any country, because the international community has a collective responsibility to defend all countries. You will not be left to defend yourself, and you will not need to use weapons of mass destruction. And we will not accept the use of weapons of mass destruction by any country under any circumstance as part of their national defense, until we can begin to make clear that this is the understanding of all countries and especially the most powerful countries in the world, you're not going to convince small countries that feel vulnerable and insecure that nuclear weapons are not an answer to their security. Well, it's certainly true that many countries who have felt insecure have decided that nuclear weapons are not an answer. We also need to recognize that there are many countries that shelter under the nuclear umbrella of others. Right? I mean, we should not forget that NATO is a nuclear-armed alliance. And even though many countries in NATO do not have nuclear weapons of their own, and do not even have nuclear weapons on their territory, they are still defended by the commitments that NATO members have made to each other, to the collective defense. And so that's one set of countries. It's also important to remember that there are countries that are part of nuclear weapon-free zones and have individually and collectively decided not to have nuclear weapons. And that is a very good model for countries to think about. But I think one has to recognize that in those countries which have given up nuclear weapons programs, like Brazil and Argentina, the giving up of nuclear weapons was also part of a democratic process in those countries where there was a transition from military dictatorship to democracy, where democratic governments came into power and said, we don't want to have our country dominated by military ways of thinking, where national security is more important than the common good of the people. And so one of the dilemmas that we see, especially in countries like Pakistan and North Korea, is where the dominance of the military over decision making means that the process of moving those countries away from nuclear weapons will have to be part of the democratic process developing in those countries, where civilian governments who feel a responsibility to answer and meet the needs of their citizens takes priority over national security and defense through military means. And so these two things, I think one has to keep them in mind, that in most countries that don't have nuclear weapons, democracy works. And in countries which have nuclear weapons, democracy is always a problem, because nuclear weapons programs are largely a secret. They're largely kept outside the decision-making process. And where those two things come together, where you have countries that are not democratic at all and have nuclear weapons, the problem of getting those countries to give up their nuclear weapons is a double problem. It's a security problem and a democracy problem. The role of civil society has been fundamental, not just to the test ban though, but to many issues of peace and security. The role of citizens was fundamental to ending the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union by protesting the policies of the superpowers. And now what we're seeing in South Asia is that people have started to realize that even though Pakistan and India have had wars in the past, now that we have nuclear weapons, war would be catastrophic beyond any possible imagination. And that we do need to have public pressure to restrain the governments and to get them to understand that we need to change the relationship between these two countries. And so over the past decade or so, there's been enormous progress in efforts by civil society to cross the barriers and to challenge the right of governments to be the sole representatives of their people. What happens is that governments claim, we speak for the people of our country. So the government of Pakistan says, we speak for the people of Pakistan. And the government of India says, we speak for the government of India. And what civil society is trying to do on both sides is to say, no, you don't. Right? We also have a voice of our own. And we want that voice to be heard. And we will start by speaking to each other, to civil society dialogues, and to arrive at a common understanding that is not the position of the government of Pakistan or the position of the government of India, but a common position agreed on by civil society in the two countries. And we will then confront both our governments with these ideas that we have of how to promote peace and better relations. For many people, nuclear weapons are about fear and war. People only think about nuclear weapons at times of crisis. And that's been true of policymakers and of ordinary people. And with the end of the Cold War, for many people, the problem of nuclear weapons basically went away, and they haven't thought about them since. And the end of the Cold War was such a long time ago now that an entire generation has grown up free from the fear of nuclear war. Even though the nuclear weapons still exist, because there has been no crisis that has brought nuclear weapons to the front pages of their newspapers involving their country, or a global conflict of the kind that used to happen during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So they don't think about nuclear weapons. Many of them don't even know about the problems of nuclear weapons or the threat of nuclear weapons. And so when we want to build capacity, one has to think about this question of what are we building the capacity for? Right? For many people, nuclear weapons are a legacy issue, a leftover from a different era of history. And there's not very much interest in learning about that. I think one of the things that we do need to think about is how to reframe the issue of nuclear weapons, and how policymakers and experts and ordinary people think about nuclear weapons, that it's not just about crisis and war when you think about nuclear weapons. What you have to think about when you think about nuclear weapons are larger questions about the responsibility of the human community to itself and to the future. To think about issues of what does it mean for countries to defend themselves using weapons that would create genocide if they ever happened? And what would be the humanitarian implications of nuclear war no matter where it happened, not just to you and to your country? So I think we need to get beyond the old ways that most people had of thinking about nuclear weapons. And if we're going to build capacity and have people engage with the issue of nuclear weapons, then we have to reflect that for many people now, especially for young people, the key issues are issues of climate change, of global equity and fairness, of the enormous inequalities that they see in the world around them. And we have to recognize and build on those values and those sensibilities.